People think witchcraft is loud. They imagine candles, chanting, strange symbols, and dramatic rituals. That image is convenient because it hides the truth. The most effective spiritual control never announces itself. It doesn't feel dark. It doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like a thought that sounds like your own voice. When I was involved in witchcraft, one of the first things I was taught had nothing to do with spells. It was about the human mind. We were told very clearly that the mind is the main gate, and whatever passes through it with permission doesn't need force anymore. Spirits don't break in where they're invited. They wait for agreement. That agreement doesn't take long. There is something called the 7-second rule. It was explained to me as a window, not a ritual, a moment where a thought arrives and the person decides consciously or unconsciously whether it stays or leaves. If the thought is rejected immediately, it has no power. If it's entertained, even silently, something shifts. Those few seconds decide whether a door opens. Most people don't believe this because they underestimate thoughts. They think thoughts are harmless until acted upon. But thoughts are where action is born. They are the place where permission is given long before behavior shows up. I remember being told that spirits listen more closely to internal dialogue than spoken words. What you repeat to yourself, what you agree with emotionally, what you justify, those things speak louder than prayers said, out of habit. The spiritual realm responds to alignment, not noise. 7 seconds was always emphasized. Not because it's magic, but because that's often how long it takes for a thought to move from suggestion to acceptance. The moment a person starts feeling the thought, instead of observing it, the gate begins to open. Agreement doesn't have to sound like yes. It can sound like that makes sense. It can sound like maybe. It can sound like this is just how I am. It can feel like comfort, relief, or validation. And once agreement happens, influence follows naturally. We were trained to pay attention to emotional weakness, not because emotions are bad, but because they lower defenses. Exhaustion, loneliness, rejection, anger, desire, insecurity. These moments make the mind less guarded. A tired mind doesn't challenge thoughts as quickly. A wounded heart is more likely to listen to the wrong voice. I saw how this worked again and again. A thought of fear would appear. If it was dismissed, nothing followed. But if the person replayed it, imagined outcomes, felt the fear in their body, something attached itself to that agreement. After that, fear returned more easily. It felt familiar, it felt personal, it felt justified. That's how influence grows, quietly, patiently. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is thinking that spiritual attacks feel foreign. In reality, the most effective ones feel natural. They feel like your own reasoning, your own emotion, your own personality. That's why people defend thoughts that are harming them. They think letting go would mean losing a part of themselves. Repetition strengthens agreement. The more a thought is allowed to stay, the more authority it gains. Over time, people stop seeing it as a visitor. They start seeing it as truth. That's when patterns form. And patterns are what spirits attach themselves to. I was taught that spirits don't need perfection. They need consistency. One repeated agreement is worth more than 100 resisted temptations. That's why the smallest thoughts matter. The ones people brush off, the ones they say don't mean anything. I've watched self-hatred grow from a single repeated thought. I'm not enough. At first, it felt like honesty. Then it felt like identity. Eventually, it felt unchangeable. But it didn't start that way. It started with agreement held just long enough to let it settle. Anger works the same way. Lust works the same way. Hopelessness works the same way. The door doesn't open all at once. It opens slowly through permission given in moments people don't guard. The most dangerous thing is delay. When someone argues with a thought instead of rejecting it, they believe they're fighting. But debate is still engagement, and engagement keeps the door cracked open. Authority comes from refusal, not conversation. This is why distraction is so effective. A distracted mind doesn't notice how long it's holding onto a thought. Time passes unnoticed. 7 seconds turn into minutes. Minutes turn into habits. Habits turn into strongholds. When I left witchcraft, this knowledge didn't disappear. It followed me. And the hardest discipline wasn't changing my environment. It was retraining my mind. I had to learn to cut thoughts off immediately, without explaining them to myself, without emotional attachment, because I knew exactly what happens when you hesitate. Most people think freedom starts with changing behavior. It doesn't. It starts with guarding agreement. What you allow to stay in your mind shapes what feels normal in your life. Not every thought deserves attention. Not every feeling deserves validation. Some thoughts are invitations, not reflections of who you are. Discernment is recognizing that quickly. The mind was never meant to be a public space. It was meant to be guarded. Once you understand how quickly agreement forms, you stop being passive. You stop assuming every thought belongs to you. You stop carrying things that were never meant to stay. What enters your mind is not always your choice. What stays there almost always is. And once you understand that, the door doesn't open so easily anymore. Once you understand that agreement opens doors, the next thing you need to understand is how intentionally that agreement is targeted. Nothing about this is random. Thoughts don't just wander into the mind by accident. Many of them are placed, timed, and reinforced through patterns most people never question. One of the most effective methods we used wasn't spiritual in appearance at all. It was environmental. What people see repeatedly, what they hear repeatedly, what they emotionally connect with repeatedly. All of it trains the mind to lower resistance. Familiarity feels safe, and what feels safe is rarely challenged. This is why certain thoughts don't shock you anymore. They would have terrified you once. Now they feel normal. Music was one of the strongest tools, not because of melody alone, but because of repetition combined with emotion. When words are repeated while emotion is activated, agreement forms faster. People sing things they would never consciously confess. They repeat ideas wrapped in rhythm and call it harmless. But the mind doesn't separate entertainment from alignment. It only knows repetition. Visuals work the same way. Images bypass logic. They move straight into imagination. Once imagination accepts something, the mind begins to build familiarity around it. Familiarity creates tolerance. Tolerance becomes agreement. We understood this deeply. That's why we paid attention to what people watched when they were tired, late at night, when defenses were low, when emotions were already stirred. That's when the 7-second window stretches wider. Relationships were another access point. People trust voices they love. They absorb beliefs from those they admire. When someone you trust speaks a thought, you don't guard against it the same way. You sit with it longer. You consider it. You feel it. Agreement forms quietly. This is how identities are shaped without people realizing it. A thought repeated by a friend becomes internal dialogue. A joke repeated enough becomes belief. A label spoken often enough becomes self-definition. Spirits don't attach to random thoughts. They attach to patterns of agreement. Whatever a person consistently aligns with emotionally becomes a legal ground. Fear invites fear. Lust invites lust. Bitterness invites bitterness. Pride invites pride. Despair invites heaviness. I was taught that spirits specialize. They don't waste time where they aren't welcomed. They move where agreement is already forming. That's why some people struggle with the same thing for years, despite trying to stop. They keep fighting behavior, but protecting agreement. There's something else most people don't realize. When a thought is rejected late instead of early, it often returns stronger, not because it gained power, but because resistance trained it. It learned what angle worked best. It learned what emotional door was weakest. This is why some thoughts seem persistent. They aren't random, they're strategic. People think resisting means arguing, but argument still keeps the thought present. It still feeds it attention. True resistance is dismissal. L. No emotional engagement. No explanation. No justification. Just refusal. I learned that spirits pay attention to emotional reaction more than words. Anger feeds anger. Fear feeds fear. Shame feeds shame. Even frustration can be nourishment. Neutral rejection starves influence. That's why panic never helps. Panic shortens discernment. When someone panics over a thought, they hold it longer. They replay it. They analyze it. They fear what it means. And fear is agreement disguised as concern. We use this knowledge to keep doors open once they were cracked. Once a person identified with the struggle, they defended it. That's just how I am. That sentence is one of the strongest forms of agreement there is. It turns a temporary influence into a permanent identity. The moment someone believes change is impossible, resistance collapses. Hopelessness is one of the most effective anchors. It convinces people to stop guarding their mind because they believe guarding won't matter. Another thing we understood was timing. Attacks often came right after progress, after spiritual moments, after emotional breakthroughs, because that's when people relax. They assume the battle is over. They stop watching their thoughts closely. That's when subtle thoughts slip in. Pride, doubt, discouragement, comparison. They don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, wearing reason. I remember being warned that light exposure doesn't eliminate influence automatically. Awareness has to be maintained. A guarded mind is not a tense mind. It's an intentional one. It knows what belongs and what doesn't. The truth is, not every thought needs analysis. Some thoughts need eviction. People exhaust themselves by overthinking things that should have been rejected instantly. The longer a thought stays, the more complicated it feels to remove. Simplicity is power. Refusal is strength. I had to unlearn the habit of entertaining thoughts just because they appeared. I had to accept that not everything that comes to mind deserves space. That realization alone broke patterns that had followed me for years. What most people don't realize is that freedom feels quiet at first. There's no dramatic moment. Just less noise, less pressure, less internal argument. Peace feels unfamiliar when the mind has been crowded for a long time. Once agreements stop, influence weakens naturally. There's no need to fight endlessly. Doors close when permission is removed. The 7-second rule works both ways. Just as quickly as agreement forms, rejection can cut it off if it happens early. That's why awareness matters more than effort. Catching the thought matters more than wrestling it. This is why guarding the mind isn't about fear, it's about authority. You were never meant to host every passing voice. Discernment is knowing what doesn't belong and not apologizing for removing it. The most powerful shift happens when you stop identifying with intrusive thoughts and start seeing them as invitations you can decline. Once you understand that, the mind becomes quieter. The pressure eases. The door stays closed. And when the door stays closed long enough, the house begins to feel like your own again. There is something else I need to say, because without this, everything before it would feel incomplete. Understanding how doors open is important, but understanding how they stay closed is where freedom actually lives. Awareness alone doesn't change anything, unless it leads to authority. And authority begins the moment you stop reacting and start deciding. One of the biggest mistakes people make is thinking they have to feel strong to guard their mind. Strength is not a feeling, it's a position. I learned that the hard way. There were days when my emotions felt heavy, when memories resurfaced, when old thought patterns tried to return. But I discovered something powerful during that time. Authority works even when emotions don't cooperate. Thoughts don't need to be defeated emotionally. They need to be dismissed positionally. When I finally understood this, everything shifted. I stopped trying to overpower thoughts with effort. I stopped explaining myself to my own mind. I stopped negotiating. I simply refused to host what didn't belong. And the more consistently I did that, the quieter things became. This is where many people get confused. They believe peace comes after the struggle ends. In reality, peace comes when you stop struggling the wrong way. Wrestling with thoughts keeps them present. Starving them removes their influence. I used to believe that intrusive thoughts meant failure. That belief alone kept me trapped longer than necessary. But thoughts appearing doesn't mean agreement exists. It only means an invitation was sent. And invitations can be declined without guilt, fear, or explanation. Another thing I had to learn was patience. Some doors close instantly, others close through consistency. Patterns that formed through repeated agreement don't disappear overnight, but they do weaken when permission is consistently withdrawn. Influence fades when it's no longer fed. This is where many people give up too early. They expect immediate silence. When silence doesn't come right away, they assume nothing is changing. But change is often subtle before it's obvious. Less intensity, less frequency, less emotional pull. These are signs of weakening, not failure. The mind learns new habits just like it learned old ones. Repetition built the door. Repetition closes it. There's also something important about responsibility that needs to be said gently. Taking responsibility for your agreement does not mean blaming yourself. Blame weakens. Responsibility empowers. When you recognize your authority, you stop seeing yourself as a victim of your own thoughts. I had to forgive myself for what I didn't know. I had to release shame over how long some patterns lasted. Shame is another form of agreement, and it keeps doors open. Compassion, combined with discipline, closes them. One of the most freeing realizations I had was this: I don't owe every thought my attention. Attention is currency. What you pay attention to grows. What you ignore with authority shrinks. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is space reclaimed. As the noise faded, something else became clearer. My intuition sharpened. Discernment became easier. I could recognize what didn't belong faster. That speed matters. Early recognition prevents late resistance. I also learned to pay attention to what strengthened my mind. Rest mattered. Stillness mattered. Honest self-reflection mattered. A guarded mind isn't built through fear. It's built through clarity. People often ask why certain environments feel heavy and others feel light. It's not always about location. It's about agreement. The mind carries atmosphere. When inner doors close, external pressure loses its grip. I noticed that when I stopped agreeing internally, external triggers lost their power. Things that once provoked me no longer had access. not because they disappeared, but because the door they used was no longer available. That's when I understood something profound. Spiritual warfare is not loud. It's disciplined. It's quiet decisions made consistently. It's knowing when to stop engaging. This is why guarding the mind is an act of self-respect. You protect what you value, and your inner world is worth protecting. There is no shame in learning late. There is no failure in needing practice. Authority grows through use. The more you exercise discernment, the stronger it becomes. You don't need to fear thoughts. Fear gives them importance. Calm refusal removes their relevance. Not everything that feels real is true. Not everything that sounds familiar belongs to you. The mind was designed to be led, not invaded. When you take your place as its guardian, clarity replaces confusion. Peace replaces noise. Stability replaces chaos. And here is the truth that brings everything together. Doors don't close because darkness is defeated dramatically. They close because permission is withdrawn consistently. 7 seconds can open a door, but awareness can close it just as fast. Once you understand that, you stop living reactively. You stop being surprised by your inner world. You become intentional. And when intention replaces reaction, the mind becomes a place of rest again. Not a battlefield, not a prison, but a home.